Here we are, country number 3, Eswatini, or Swaziland. We'll get to the name discrepancy. Today is the little notch in South Africa, like what you'd get if you took a melon baller to South Africa's eastern border. Eswatini is nestled between South Africa and Mozambique, a cute half circle. It's roughly divided in two by the wooded Drakensberg slopes in the west and a valley crossed by several rivers, the southern spur of the Lowveld. On the eastern border are the Lebombo Mountains, which are fairly low, but of the same basalt that forms the Lesotho highlands. The climate here is subtropical. The western uplands mild like the veldt, the eastern valley hotter and drier. The rainy season is during the summer, the northern hemisphere's winter. Alright, you know the drill. San, then Kwekwe, then the Bantu around the beginning of the first millennium AD. The Drakensberg is a nice physical boundary to separate the divergence of the Sotho from the Nguni and Tsonga of East Southern Africa. But the boundary between those two is a lot less clear. I drew it here at the Sabi River, tributary of the Komati, mainly because that's about the boundary between Tsonga and Swazi speakers in South Africa today. Records are, of course, a little hard to come by, but the kind of societies these people lived in possessed a certain fluidity that is a little harder for us modernites to appreciate, what with our land and property offices and surveys and government censuses. Bantu society was based around clans, a group of related families living in a community. Local chiefs periodically united clans against common threats before the tribal confederacy fell apart or sat dormant. Conquered tribes might displace clans, taking their land, cattle, and people, or attempt to integrate them. In this environment, clans could easily adopt the customs and language of whoever happened to be the most powerful at the time. This flexible definition of who might be considered Nguni or Tsonga is complicated further by the incredibly low population densities, by our modern standards, of this part of the world at the time, with vast stretches of wilderness between clans, and often clans migrated around when local farm and grazeland had been depleted. The ancestors of the Swazi probably lived in this region, probably even around Delagoa Bay. A clan of Tsonga, the Runga, probably joined the Swazi there around the 16th, 17th centuries, likely edging them out to west of the Lebombo Mountains. Eswatini has a tradition of rulers stretching back almost 1,000 years, though they're difficult to attest historically. By 1744, a clan of Nguni, the Ngwane, named after their leader Ngwane III, had settled around the Pongola River. Ngwane's name might be related to the title his people gave him, Ingwenyama, the Lion. The British later called the Ingwenyama paramount chief, like the ruler of Basutoland, but the Lion is the king of beasts, and Ngwane III was king of his people. The Ngwane had a peculiar constitution because the king's mother was traditionally called the Indlovukati, the she-elephant, and like an elephant matron, offered her wisdom. The king ruled his people, but his mother was charged with important religious duties. The Indlovukati would also rule in the stead of their sons until they came of age. Sobhuza I was king of the Ngwane during the Mfetane, and avoided the worst of Shaka Zulu by allying with him. In the meantime, he continued gathering and conquering more clans, Nguni, Tsonga, and even Sotho, to his kingdom of Gwangwane, the South African Bantustan for the Swazi, by the way. By the 1840s and 50s, southern Africa was changing quickly with the intrusion of the Boers and the expansion of British and Portuguese power. Sobhuza's successor was Mswati II, a strong warrior who fought off the Zulu and Gaza and solidified the Ngwane's position. I wasn't able to find what his name meant, but the Zulu rendered it as Mswazi, and it is by this that the Europeans came to call his people the Swazi. 1852 saw the recognition of the Transvaal Republic by Britain, and the Boers claimed territory to Delagoa Bay, where the Portuguese had established the town of Lourenço Marques in 1850. The Transvaal Boers would fight several wars to secure control over their claimed land. They moved on Delagoa Bay in 1868, but acquiesced to Portuguese claims in 1869, leaving the remainder of their claims inconclusive when Britain annexed them in 1877. During that brief time, the Swazi offered their assistance against the petty king Sekukune. As a reward, the British recognized and guaranteed Swazi independence, and in 1881, Swaziland became a protected state, which is like a protectorate but maintains control over its foreign affairs. And here's where Swaziland's borders were defined. Sort of. I don't really know what they were doing with Swaziland. Its borders are mainly straight lines, a few curves, and a couple small creeks in the southwest. But for the most part, they don't really follow any major geographical features, with the exception of the Lubombo Mountains. On the eastern border, the line follows the eastern slopes until the Great Usutu River, goes west along the gorge, and then travels south along the western slopes. These odd and arbitrary sorts of borders characterize a lot of African countries, and we'll talk about them. They are often blamed for a lot of issues Africa experiences today, but of course the truth is far more nuanced and complex. What I theorized happened is though Britain ensured a Swaziland existed at all, the Transvaal probably nabbed as much juicy land as they could, while Britain had already agreed to split the coast with Portugal east of the Lubombos in 1875. The 1881 borders were reaffirmed in 1884 with the London Convention and the Transvaal's and Swaziland's independence, though Swaziland never agreed to the borders. Nevertheless, this left a lot of Swazi people in the borders of the Transvaal, in a similar manner to Basotho in the Free State and Tswana in Cape Colony. In fact, more of each of these people live in the South African territories than in their own respective nation-states, though in Swaziland the difference is far smaller. Tensions continued with the Transvaal Boers, even in 1894 when Britain agreed to let Swaziland become a protected state under the Transvaal. This lasted, of course, until the Second Boer War, when Swazis were actually recruited to fight for the British. Swaziland was finally freed in 1902 with the British annexation of Transvaal, only for Britain to impose full protectorate status the next year, placed under the authority of the High Commission for Southern Africa, which set up Mbabane. The protectorate was expected to be temporary, again because of the Greater South Africa Project, where Swaziland almost certainly would have been annexed to Transvaal province. After 1924, this was postponed indefinitely, and to their credit, the British wanted to spare their little protectorate from the increased segregation and discrimination the South African government was enacting after 1948. In 1952, increased autonomy was given to the King of Swaziland, and as decolonization in Africa progressed, the British government began wanting to cut their losses and prepare Swaziland for independence. A parliament was elected in 1967, and a constitution enacted in 1968, along with independence from Britain. The dominance of the king's political party allowed Sobhuza II to suspend the constitution and rule as an absolute monarch, unrestricted by any laws, as was the custom before the protectorate. Fun fact, during apartheid, the South African government attempted to transfer the Kangwane and part of the KwaZulu Bantustans to Swaziland in 1982, but this proved too unpopular. Swaziland had claimed these territories, and continues to claim them, but hasn't really done anything to acquire them since. Despite some reforms in the 90s and a 2003 constitution, Swaziland remains an absolute monarchy, one of the last in the world, and the only one in Africa. In 2018, King Mswati III changed the country's name from Swaziland to Eswatini, which is just the native Siswati version of the name. This was done to commemorate the country's 50th anniversary of independence and to avoid confusion with Switzerland. But, and this will pop up again, despite the official name change, it isn't incorrect to continue calling it Swaziland, especially if you grew up with that name. Old habits and all. Naturally, Eswatini has very few political or social rights, and wouldn't you know, lots of poverty and prevalence of HIV, poor public services, yada yada yada. Eswatini, though, has hitched its wagon to South Africa, like Lesotho, pegging its currency, the Lilangeni, to the rand. Unlike the other little kingdom in South Africa's shadow, Democratic Lesotho, it doesn't look like Eswatini will have meaningful political change anytime soon. But economically, it is growing, and the king, at least, has lots of money. And how could you not love African wildlife? Next time, we'll round out the High Commission with Botswana, which will be a little more positive. Well, thanks for watching. See you there.